Two cultures, one childhood. Have you ever looked at your own child and suddenly wondered which world they truly belong to? One morning, I was packing my kids' lunch in the United States, peanut butter sandwich, apple slices. A handwritten note about being yourself, and I froze. Not because I forgot something, but because I realized I was raising a human being between two cultures, two climates. Two value systems that often disagree with each other. This video is not about perfect parenting. It's about confusion, healing, and the quiet fear every parent carries. What values will my child inherit from me, and what will America change forever? You might think culture shock only happens when you first land in the U.S. New weather, new food, new accents, new rules. But the real culture shock doesn't hit at the airport. It hits years later, inside your own living room, when your child asks a simple question that cracks something open inside you. My child once asked, "Why are we different at home than at school?" That question stayed with me longer than any winter storm or heat wave I experienced here. Let's talk about climate first, because it sounds harmless. In many parts of the U.S., seasons are aggressive. Summers don't politely arrive, they attack. Winters don't gently cool you down, they isolate you. Psychologists have found that climate affects mood, social behavior, and even parenting styles. Harsh winters increase isolation. Extreme heat increases irritability. I didn't realize it then, but moving to a different climate slowly reshaped my nervous system. And when a parent's nervous system changes, so does the emotional atmosphere a child grows up in. Now add culture on top of that. In my home culture, family means closeness, sacrifice, and unspoken understanding. In American culture, family often means independence, emotional honesty, and clear boundaries. Neither is wrong. But when they collide, confusion is born. At home, I taught my child respect through silence and obedience. At school, my child was taught confidence through speaking up and questioning authority. Imagine growing up being praised in one world for staying quiet, and in another for being loud. That's not balance. That's an identity tug-of-war. Neuroscience tells us that children build their sense of self through consistency. When values clash daily, the brain works harder to adapt. Over time, this can lead to anxiety, perfectionism, or emotional shutdown. I saw it happening in small ways. My child hesitated before answering questions. Smiled, but checked my face first. It felt like my love came with conditions I never intended to set. And then there's America itself, policies, politics, and conversations that sneak into children's minds long before we think they should. In the U.S., kids absorb ideas about freedom, race, success, and personal rights very early. Dinner table conversations here are not just about food, they're about opinions. I grew up in a culture where children listened. In America, children are encouraged to speak. When my child confidently challenged my opinion one evening, my first reaction wasn't pride. It was fear. Fear that I was losing control. Fear that my child was becoming too American. That fear said more about my wounds than about my child's future. Here's the uncomfortable truth I had to face. I wasn't just raising a child between two cultures. I was still healing from my own unfinished story. According to attachment theory, parents often pass down unresolved emotional patterns without realizing it. I wanted my child to keep my values because I was afraid of losing my identity. But parenting isn't cultural preservation. It's emotional guidance. The turning point didn't come from a book or a viral parenting video. It came from exhaustion. One night, after another argument about school, language, and why we do things this way, I realized I was fighting my child instead of fighting my fear. That's when the question changed. Not which culture should my child choose, but what kind of emotional safety do I want my child to feel? Research in developmental psychology is clear on one thing. Children don't thrive on perfect values. They thrive on being understood. Understanding regulates the nervous system. It lowers cortisol. It builds trust. When a child feels understood, they don't have to choose sides. They integrate. And integration is healing. So I started small. I listened more than I corrected. I explained my values instead of enforcing them. I allowed questions without taking them as disrespect. I stopped seeing American culture as a threat and started seeing it as a tool. Independence didn't have to erase compassion. Freedom didn't have to destroy family bonds. Two cultures didn't have to mean one broken childhood. If you're raising kids between cultures in the U.S., here's something grounding to hold on to. Values are not what you demand. They are what you model under stress. Your child isn't watching your rules. They're watching how you handle confusion, disagreement, and change. They're learning how to belong by observing how you make space for difference inside yourself first. Looking back, I wish someone had told me this earlier. Understanding heals faster than control ever will. You don't lose your culture by letting your child grow. You lose your child by refusing to grow with them. And strangely enough, when I loosened my grip, my values didn't disappear. They softened, adapted, and became something my child could actually carry into the future. Raising a child between two cultures isn't about choosing sides. It's about choosing connection. And that choice, made daily in small moments, is where healing truly begins. When climate changes people. Have you ever noticed how the weather can change your personality before you even realize it? Not in a poetic way, but in a quiet, sneaky way, like how you become more patient on a sunny day or strangely irritated when the sky stays gray for too long. I didn't think climate mattered much when I first came to the United States. I thought culture was about language, food, and values. I was wrong. Climate was the first teacher, and I didn't know I was taking its class. In the U.S., climate is not just background noise. It's a lifestyle architect. In some states, winter stretches so long it feels personal, like the sky has a grudge against you. In others, the heat presses down on your chest, making even small decisions feel exhausting. At first, I told myself, it's just weather. But slowly, I noticed something unsettling. I was changing. And so was the way I showed up as a parent, a partner, and a human being. Psychology backs this up. Studies show that prolonged cold can increase feelings of isolation and sadness, while extreme heat is linked to higher aggression and emotional fatigue. Your brain doesn't treat climate as neutral data. It treats it as a survival signal. When survival mode is on, patience drops. Empathy shrinks. Everything becomes more urgent, more defensive. I didn't connect the dots at first. I just thought I was becoming less tolerant, less warm, less like the person I used to be. And children feel this even more intensely. Their nervous systems are still learning how to regulate. When the environment feels harsh or unpredictable, they look to adults for emotional cues. I remember one winter in the Midwest. Snow everywhere. Days without sunlight. My child became quieter. Less playful. I responded by pushing routines harder, bedtimes, rules, structure, thinking discipline would fix it. What I didn't realize was that my child didn't need more control. They needed more emotional warmth to compensate for the physical cold. In warmer states, I saw the opposite. Long summers. Bright days. People smiling more, but also snapping faster. Heat does something strange to the brain. It drains cognitive energy. Small frustrations feel huge. I caught myself reacting sharply over nothing. A spilled drink. A slow morning. And then came the guilt. The American parenting culture often emphasizes emotional awareness. But nobody really prepares you for how much climate messes with your emotional bandwidth. Here's where it gets complicated for immigrants and multicultural families. Climate change stacks on top of cultural change. You're already translating values, languages, and expectations. Now you're also managing a body that feels unfamiliar in this environment. Neuroscientists call this cognitive load. The brain has limited resources. When too many systems are under stress, something gives. Often, it's patience. Or presence. Or joy. I remember asking myself one uncomfortable question. Am I parenting differently because I believe differently, or because I'm tired all the time? That question hurt. Because the answer wasn't flattering. Climate had quietly reshaped my daily energy levels, my moods, and my tolerance for chaos. And my child was adapting to that version of me. There's also a deeper layer. Climate influences social behavior. In colder regions, people stay indoors more. Social circles shrink. Loneliness increases. In warmer regions, life happens outside, but privacy decreases. As a family, we oscillated between isolation and overstimulation depending on where we lived. My child learned flexibility, yes, but also uncertainty. Which version of life is normal, they once asked. I didn't have a clear answer. From a developmental psychology perspective, children need predictability to feel safe. Climate instability, whether seasonal extremes or frequent relocations, can subtly disrupt that sense of safety. Not dramatically. Just enough to make a child more vigilant, more observant, more cautious. I saw my child becoming an emotional weather forecaster, scanning my mood before deciding how to act. That realization hit hard. I didn't want my child learning emotional survival skills before learning joy. So I changed one thing. Not the climate. Not the location. I changed how I interpreted our reactions. Instead of blaming myself or my child, I started naming the invisible factor. It's been a long winter. The heat is making everything feel heavier. Naming it externalized the stress. Research shows that naming stressors reduces their emotional impact. It gave both of us permission to feel without self-judgment. I also adjusted expectations. Fewer activities during harsh weather. More grace on bad days. Shorter conversations when tempers ran high. These are not parenting hacks. They are nervous system accommodations. When you treat your family like a living ecosystem instead of a performance project, something softens. Here's the surprising part. Once I stopped fighting the effects of climate, I became more present. More forgiving. My child relaxed. Laughter returned in small, ordinary moments. Climate didn't stop influencing us, but it stopped controlling us. If you're raising kids in the U.S. and feeling like you're failing in ways you can't explain, pause before blaming your values or your culture. Ask a simpler question. Is my environment asking more from my nervous system than I can give right now? That question alone can open a door to healing. Climate changes people. Quietly. Relentlessly. But awareness changes the story. When you understand the forces shaping your reactions, you stop turning survival responses into character flaws. And when a child grows up watching you adapt with compassion instead of denial, they learn something powerful. Difficulty doesn't define who we are. How we respond to it does. In the end, climate taught me an unexpected lesson. You can't control the weather, but you can become the emotional shelter your child remembers. And that, more than any temperature or season, is what shapes a childhood. Culture shock inside home. Imagine this scene. The front door closes, shoes come off, and suddenly the outside world disappears. You're home. Same walls, same furniture, same family. This should feel safe. Familiar. Predictable. But for many families raising children in the United States between two cultures, home becomes the most confusing place of all. Not because there is no love, but because there are too many invisible rules competing for space. I used to believe culture shock happened in public. At work. At school. At the grocery store when someone smiled and asked, "How are you?" without actually waiting for the answer. But the deepest culture shock didn't come from strangers. It came from my own living room, when my child crossed the threshold and quietly switched personalities. One version for school. Another for home. Watching that switch felt like witnessing a tiny identity fracture in real time. Inside our home, values were clear, at least to me. Respect elders. Don't talk back. Family comes first. Emotions are managed privately. Outside, American culture taught something else entirely. Speak your mind. Advocate for yourself. Express emotions openly. Question authority respectfully. None of these values are wrong. The problem is what happens when a child is expected to obey both at the same time. Developmental psychologists call this double-bind communication. A child receives two conflicting messages, both important, both coming from trusted systems. The brain doesn't choose one. It tries to satisfy both. That effort costs energy. Over time, it creates anxiety, hesitation, and self-doubt. I saw it in small pauses before my child spoke. In the way they scanned my face before answering a question. In the careful emotional calculations that no child should have to make. At first, I blamed American culture. Then I blamed myself for not adapting enough. Neither explanation helped. What helped was noticing how often I corrected my child at home for behaviors praised at school. Confidence became disrespect. Curiosity became arguing. Emotional honesty became drama. I wasn't trying to suppress my child. I was trying to protect my values. But protection can look a lot like pressure when you're on the receiving end. Neuroscience offers an uncomfortable insight here. A child's brain is wired to seek attachment before authenticity. Belonging comes first. Self-expression comes later. When home feels conditional, when love seems tied to behaving a certain cultural way, the child adapts by shrinking parts of themselves. Not because they're weak. Because their brain is doing its job. One evening, after a long day, my child said something that cut deeper than any argument. "I don't know which version of me you want." That sentence landed heavy. It revealed something I hadn't wanted to see. My child wasn't confused about culture. They were confused about acceptance. This is where many immigrant parents get stuck. We tell ourselves we're preserving culture. In reality, we're often preserving fear of losing identity, fear of being erased, fear of raising children who no longer understand where they come from. Those fears are valid. But when they go unexamined, they leak into daily interactions. Tone changes. Corrections increase. Warmth decreases. And the home becomes another place the child must perform. Psychological research shows that children raised in environments with inconsistent cultural expectations often develop heightened emotional intelligence, but also heightened stress responses. They become excellent observers, quick adapters, emotional translators. These are strengths later in life. But in childhood, they come at a cost. Hyper-awareness replaces ease. Self-monitoring replaces play. The turning point for me wasn't a parenting strategy. It was a shift in perspective. I stopped asking, how do I make my child fit both cultures? And started asking, how do I make home a place where my child doesn't have to fit anything? That question changed everything. I began separating values from behaviors. Respect didn't have to mean silence. Family loyalty didn't have to mean self-erasure. Emotional restraint didn't have to mean emotional suppression. I explained the why behind my values instead of enforcing the how. According to cognitive psychology, meaning creates cooperation faster than authority ever will. When children understand purpose, their brains engage differently. Defense lowers. Curiosity rises. Something subtle shifted. My child started talking more at home, not less. Disagreements didn't disappear, but they softened. We weren't negotiating cultures anymore, we were negotiating understanding. And understanding, it turns out, is incredibly regulating for the nervous system. If you're raising kids between cultures in the U.S. and feeling tension at home, pause before assuming something is wrong with your child, or with you. Look instead at the invisible rules operating under the surface. Ask which ones are necessary, and which ones are inherited fear wearing the costume of tradition. Home doesn't have to be a cultural battlefield. It can be a translation space. A place where values are explained, not enforced. Where questions are welcomed, not feared. Where a child doesn't have to switch personalities to belong. The irony is this. The more emotionally safe home became, the more my child naturally carried our values into the outside world. Not because they were forced to, but because they were rooted. Culture survives best not through control, but through connection. In the end, culture shock inside the home taught me something essential. Children don't need us to protect culture from them. They need us to invite them into it, gently, honestly, and without fear. When home becomes a place of understanding, identity stops feeling like a choice. It becomes a story they're proud to continue. Politics at the dinner table. Picture a quiet dinner. Plates warm. Forks clinking. A child asking about their day. Then a headline slips into the room like smoke under a door. In the United States, politics doesn't wait for adulthood. It arrives early, sits down uninvited, and starts shaping how families talk, argue, and love. I learned this the hard way, when the dinner table, once a place of stories, became a place of tension. Back where I grew up, politics stayed far from children. Adults discussed it carefully, often privately. Silence was considered maturity. In America, silence can look like avoidance. Opinions are encouraged. Questions are praised. Children absorb civic language the way they absorb slang, quickly, casually, without context. One evening, my child repeated a phrase they heard at school. Not rude. Not aggressive. Just confident. My body reacted before my brain did. Chest tight. Jaw clenched. The reflex to shut it down was instant. That reaction wasn't about the sentence. It was about fear. Fear that politics would divide us. Fear that my child would be pulled into a world I didn't fully understand. Fear that values I held sacred would be labeled outdated at a school lunch table. According to effective neuroscience, fear narrows perception. When fear is active, the brain prioritizes control over connection. I didn't want a debate. I wanted safety. American culture treats political discussion as a skill, something to practice. My culture treated it as a risk, something to manage. At the dinner table, those two philosophies collided. My child leaned in with curiosity. I leaned back with caution. The gap between us wasn't ideological. It was emotional. Research on family systems shows that children don't adopt beliefs from arguments. They adopt beliefs from tone. When conversations feel charged, children learn that opinions are dangerous. When conversations feel curious, children learn that disagreement is survivable. I realized I was teaching my child to fear conversation, not to think critically. That was never my intention. There's another layer here that's easy to miss. Politics in the U.S. is deeply emotional. It ties into identity, morality, and belonging. For immigrant families, it also ties into gratitude and survival. When you've benefited from a system, questioning it can feel disloyal. When you've been excluded by a system, defending it can feel naive. These emotional histories sit at the table too, even when nobody names them. One night, after a particularly tense exchange, my child asked, "Why does this make you upset?" That question stopped me. Children ask honest questions when they feel safe enough to notice our emotions. I paused and answered truthfully, not strategically. I said, "Because I'm scared of losing you to ideas I don't understand yet." The room softened. Not because we agreed, but because fear had been named. Psychology calls this emotional transparency. When adults label their emotions, children's stress responses decrease. The brain relaxes when it understands the source of tension. Suddenly, politics wasn't a threat. It was a topic. And topics can be explored. I set new rules, not for opinions, but for tone. Curiosity before conclusion. Questions before judgments. No shaming. No sarcasm. These aren't political rules. They're nervous system rules. They keep the conversation from triggering fight or flight. Over time, the dinner table changed. Not quieter. Safer. Here's the surprising part. My values didn't disappear when I stopped controlling the conversation. They became clearer. I could explain why certain principles mattered to me, community, empathy, responsibility, without tying them to a party or policy. Cognitive psychology shows that values stick better when they're abstracted from arguments and grounded in stories. So I told stories. About neighbors. About choices. About consequences. My child listened differently. Children raised in the U.S. will encounter politics early whether we invite it or not. Schools encourage civic engagement. Media amplifies emotion. Peer groups reward confidence. Trying to keep politics out of the home doesn't protect children, it leaves them alone with it. The dinner table can be a laboratory for learning how to disagree without disconnecting. I also had to face something uncomfortable. Sometimes my resistance wasn't wisdom. It was exhaustion. Translating culture all day drains emotional energy. When energy is low, tolerance shrinks. On those days, I learned to postpone conversations instead of exploding in them. Let's talk about this tomorrow became a gift, not a failure. Self-regulation models regulation. There's science behind this restraint. The prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for reasoning, shuts down under emotional overload. Waiting isn't avoidance. It's biology. When I respected my limits, I showed my child that boundaries are not silence, they're care. If politics is creeping into your family life in the U.S., don't ask how to control the conversation. Ask how to contain it. Containment means safety, structure, and permission to feel without attacking. It means teaching children that disagreement doesn't equal rejection. That ideas can be challenged without people being dismissed. In time, something beautiful happened. My child began asking how to think, not what to think. That shift matters. It's the difference between indoctrination and development. Between fear and agency. And it happened not because I won arguments, but because I stayed connected during them. The dinner table taught me a quiet truth. Politics doesn't shape children as much as emotional climate does. When understanding leads, values follow. And when a child grows up learning that conversations can be hard without being harmful, they carry that skill far beyond the table, into friendships, relationships, and a future that desperately needs more understanding. Love tested by differences. Love doesn't usually break loudly. It erodes quietly, through misunderstandings that never feel important enough to address until they pile up and start shaping the air you breathe. In the United States, where relationships are expected to be emotionally expressive and self-aware, love across cultures faces a unique kind of pressure. Not dramatic. Not obvious. Just persistent enough to make two people slowly doubt whether they're speaking the same emotional language anymore. Our relationship didn't struggle because we lacked love. It struggled because love meant different things to us. In my culture, love shows up as endurance. You stay. You sacrifice. You don't complain unless something is truly broken. In American culture, love often shows up as communication. You talk. You process. You name feelings early before they turn into resentment. When these two definitions collided, we both felt misunderstood, often at the same time. At first, the differences felt manageable. Small comments. Different expectations around time, privacy, and emotional sharing. But under stress, work, parenting, immigration paperwork, financial pressure, those differences hardened. What one of us experienced as honesty, the other experienced as criticism. What one of us experienced as loyalty, the other experienced as emotional distance. According to relationship psychology, conflict isn't caused by difference. It's caused by unmet attachment needs. And ours were screaming quietly. In the U.S., therapy language is common. Words like boundaries, needs, and triggers float easily in conversations. For someone raised to value restraint, this language can feel confrontational, even selfish. I remember feeling exposed during arguments, like love had suddenly become a performance review. My nervous system interpreted emotional questioning as danger. Not because it was harmful, but because it was unfamiliar. Science explains this reaction clearly. When people grow up in environments where emotional expression is limited, their brains associate vulnerability with risk. The amygdala lights up. Defensiveness follows. I wasn't cold. I was protecting myself using the only tools I knew. My partner wasn't demanding. They were seeking connection using the tools they learned here. Marriage counselors often talk about the pursuer-withdrawer dynamic. One partner moves closer under stress. The other moves away. Culture can amplify this pattern. In our case, American emotional directness met cultural emotional caution. The more one pushed for conversation, the more the other shut down. Not out of lack of care, but out of overload. The hardest part wasn't the arguments. It was the loneliness inside them. Sitting next to someone you love and feeling like you're failing at a language everyone else seems fluent in. That loneliness is rarely discussed in immigrant marriages. You're expected to be grateful, strong, resilient. Admitting struggle can feel like weakness. But neuroscience doesn't reward silence. It rewards safety. The turning point came unexpectedly. Not during a big fight, but during exhaustion. One night, after a long day, we sat in silence. No accusations. No problem solving. Just quiet. And in that quiet, something honest surfaced. I don't know how to love you in a way that feels right to you, one of us said. That sentence didn't solve anything. But it opened everything. Psychologists call this a repair attempt. It shifts the nervous system from defense to collaboration. The brain hears vulnerability and responds with openness. For the first time, the conversation wasn't about who was right. It was about whether we were willing to learn each other. We stopped translating love through our own cultural filters and started asking clearer questions. When I do this, what does it feel like to you? When you say that, what do you need from me? These questions sound simple. They are not. They require humility. And humility is uncomfortable when your identity has already been stretched thin by immigration and adaptation. Research shows that couples who survive cultural differences don't eliminate them. They build a shared meaning system. A third culture inside the relationship. Ours was slower. Quieter. Less dramatic than American media portrays, but warmer than what either of us had known before. Love became less about being understood instantly and more about being willing to misunderstand each other patiently. This shift changed our parenting too. Children watch how love handles conflict, not how it avoids it. When they see repair, they learn resilience. When they see curiosity, they learn safety. Our home didn't become conflict-free. It became emotionally honest without being emotionally reckless. If you're navigating love across cultures in the U.S., here's something grounding. Difficulty doesn't mean incompatibility. It often means you're translating something complex with limited emotional resources. Instead of asking, why don't you get me? Try asking, what language of care did you grow up with? That question invites history into the room, not blame. Love tested by differences can either fracture or deepen. The difference isn't effort. It's understanding. Understanding doesn't erase pain, but it makes pain negotiable. It turns conflict into information instead of a verdict. Looking back, our relationship didn't survive because we mastered communication techniques. It survived because we stopped using culture as a weapon and started using it as context. Love didn't ask us to abandon who we were. It asked us to become bilingual in care. And that, quietly, became one of the greatest lessons we passed on to our child. Love isn't about sameness. It's about staying present long enough to learn each other, again and again, without keeping score. Raising kids, losing myself. The strange thing about raising kids in the United States is that nobody warns you how easy it is to disappear while doing everything right. On the outside, life looked functional. School schedules, work deadlines, grocery lists, playdates. Inside, something was quietly unraveling. Not dramatically. Not visibly. Just enough that one day I caught myself staring at a mirror and wondering when my own voice had become background noise in my life. Parenting across cultures amplifies this effect. You're not just raising a child. You're translating worlds. Explaining expectations. Filtering messages. Adjusting yourself constantly so your child can feel stable. Psychologists call this role overload. When too many roles demand emotional labor at once, identity fatigue sets in. I didn't know the term back then. I just knew I was tired in a way sleep couldn't fix. In my culture, good parents endure quietly. Complaints are indulgent. Sacrifice is love. In American culture, good parents are encouraged to be self-aware, emotionally present, and proactive about mental health. These ideals aren't enemies, but when you try to hold them both perfectly, something cracks. I was trying to be strong and expressive, disciplined and gentle, grateful and exhausted. The math didn't add up. I started noticing the signs in small ways. Irritation at harmless questions. A tight chest during bedtime routines. Resentment followed immediately by guilt. Neuroscience explains this cycle well. Chronic stress keeps the body in a low-level fight or flight state. Cortisol stays elevated. The prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for empathy and reflection, gets less blood flow. You don't lose love. You lose access to it. What made it worse was the comparison culture. In the U.S., parenting advice is everywhere. Books, podcasts, social media. Everyone seems intentional, regulated, and thriving. When you're struggling, that image doesn't inspire. It isolates. I told myself I should be more patient, more grateful, more resilient. Self-criticism disguised itself as motivation, but it only deepened the disconnection from myself. The real loss wasn't hobbies or free time. It was agency. Decisions became reactive. Days blurred together. My child's needs always came first, which sounds noble, until you realize you no longer know how to locate your own. Attachment theory warns about this. Children need caregivers who are emotionally available, not emotionally erased. When parents disappear inside their role, children sense the imbalance and often compensate by becoming overly responsible. That realization hurt. I didn't want my child to grow up monitoring my mood, adjusting their needs to protect me. Healing required a shift, not in love, but in boundaries. American psychology talks a lot about boundaries, but boundaries aren't walls. They're oxygen. Without them, both parent and child suffocate slowly. The turning point came on an ordinary afternoon. My child was playing. I was exhausted. Instead of pushing through, I sat down and did nothing. No phone. No planning. Just stillness. At first, guilt screamed. Then something quieter emerged, sadness. Grief for the parts of myself I had postponed indefinitely. According to trauma research, grief often appears when the nervous system finally feels safe enough to stop running. I started reclaiming small pieces of myself. 10 minutes of writing. A walk without multitasking. Saying, I need a moment without explaining it away. These weren't acts of selfishness. They were acts of regulation. When parents regulate themselves, children co-regulate naturally. This is basic neurobiology, not parenting philosophy. Interestingly, my child noticed the change before I did. They became more relaxed. Less clingy. More playful. The home felt lighter. That's when it clicked. Losing myself had been costing my child more than finding myself ever could. Presence doesn't come from sacrifice alone. It comes from sustainability. In immigrant families, self-erasure is often praised. You're expected to endure for the next generation. But endurance without repair passes down exhaustion, not strength. Psychological studies on intergenerational trauma show that unprocessed stress is inherited emotionally, not genetically. Breaking that cycle requires permission to exist as a full human, not just a functional parent. I also had to confront a hard truth. Part of losing myself came from fear of judgment. In American culture, parenting is public. Mistakes feel visible. Admitting struggle feels risky. But hiding struggle teaches children that emotions should be managed alone. That's not resilience. That's isolation. So I practiced honesty at a level appropriate for a child. I'm tired today. I need a pause. This is hard for me too. These statements didn't weaken my authority. They humanized it. Emotional intelligence research shows that children raised by emotionally honest adults develop better self-regulation and empathy. They don't need perfect parents. They need real ones. Raising kids doesn't have to mean losing yourself. But it often does when care flows in only one direction. Healing begins when care becomes circular. When you allow yourself to be part of the equation. When your child sees you choose rest, boundaries, and self-respect, not as luxuries, but as necessities. Looking back, I didn't lose myself because I loved my child too much. I lost myself because I believed love required disappearance. That belief was inherited, not chosen. And like many inherited beliefs, it didn't survive close examination. Finding myself again didn't take a dramatic transformation. It took permission. And that permission quietly reshaped our family. My child didn't need a parent who vanished for them. They needed a parent who stayed, with themselves included. The silent identity crisis. There's a particular kind of crisis that doesn't announce itself. No panic attacks. No dramatic breakdowns. Just a quiet, persistent question humming in the background. Who am I becoming, and who am I allowed to be here? For many families raising children in the United States between cultures, this question lives not only in adults, but echoes silently inside their kids. Identity crisis sounds like a teenage problem. In reality, it begins much earlier. It starts the moment a child learns that different versions of themselves are rewarded in different places. At school, confidence gets applause. At home, humility earns approval. At one table, speaking up is leadership. At another, it's disrespect. The child adapts, smoothly, impressively, and invisibly. That adaptability looks like maturity. It's often mistaken for resilience. But psychologically, it's a form of constant self-editing. I noticed it when my child stopped using certain words at home. Not because they were inappropriate, but because they sounded too American. The shift was subtle. A pause before speaking. A recalculation. Neuroscience tells us that when the brain anticipates social rejection, it suppresses expression before it reaches consciousness. This isn't rebellion or confusion. It's survival. For immigrant parents, identity crisis hits differently. You're not just watching your child change. You're watching parts of yourself become optional. Language. Traditions. Emotional expressions that once felt natural now feel inconvenient. There's grief in that. But there's also fear. Fear that if you don't hold the line, everything meaningful will dissolve. Psychologists describe identity as a narrative the brain tells itself. When narratives conflict, the brain doesn't panic, it compartmentalizes. Children learn to split. One self for school. One for home. One for peers. This skill is adaptive in the short term. Long term, it can create disconnection. Adults who grew up this way often struggle to answer simple questions like what do you want? Or what do you feel? Because their internal compass learned to point outward. The silent part of this crisis is what makes it dangerous. High-functioning children rarely raise alarms. They get good grades. They behave. They translate for adults. They adjust. Teachers praise them. Families rely on them. Inside, though, there's pressure. The pressure to never fully belong anywhere, because belonging seems conditional. In the U.S., identity conversations are everywhere. Race, gender, culture, values. Kids encounter these frameworks early. For children between cultures, these conversations can feel like interrogations. Where are you from? Becomes a trick question. What do you identify as? Feels premature. The brain, still forming, tries to assemble an answer without adequate pieces. I once asked my child how they described themselves to friends. The answer was different from how they described themselves to family. Neither was fake. Both were partial. That's when it became clear. The crisis wasn't about choosing an identity. It was about lacking permission to integrate them. Attachment research offers a crucial insight here. Secure attachment allows identity exploration. When a child feels emotionally safe, they experiment without fear of abandonment. When safety feels conditional, exploration becomes risky. I realized that every time I corrected my child's American behavior at home, I was unintentionally sending a message. Parts of you are acceptable. Parts of you are not. That realization hurt. Because my intention had always been protection. But protection without curiosity turns into restriction. And restriction teaches children to hide, not to reflect. The healing shift came from reframing identity as expansion, not replacement. American culture wasn't erasing my child's roots, it was adding layers. Cognitive psychology shows that identity integration reduces stress and increases self-esteem. The brain relaxes when it doesn't have to choose. When it can say, I am both. We started naming the in-between. Talking openly about code switching. Explaining that adapting doesn't mean betraying. Sharing my own confusion instead of pretending certainty. This mattered more than any lecture. When children see adults tolerate ambiguity, their nervous systems learn that uncertainty is safe. I also stopped asking my child to represent anything. Not the culture. Not the family. Not the immigrant story. Representation is heavy. Children deserve to be individuals before they are symbols. Developmental studies show that kids burdened with representation often suppress authenticity to maintain harmony. Removing that burden is liberating. Small changes had big effects. My child began mixing languages without apology. Laughing louder at home. Asking harder questions. These weren't signs of losing identity. They were signs of relief. Identity crisis softens when expression stops being policed. If you're raising kids between cultures in the U.S., here's a grounding truth. Identity isn't something you pass down intact. It's something you co-create in context. Your child's version will look different. That difference isn't failure. It's evolution. The silent identity crisis doesn't need fixing. It needs space. Space to experiment. Space to contradict. Space to change. When a child learns that belonging doesn't require consistency, authenticity becomes possible. In the end, the goal isn't to raise a child who perfectly preserves your past. It's to raise a child who can carry it without it weighing them down. When understanding leads, identity stops feeling like a conflict and starts feeling like a resource. And that's the quiet miracle. When children are allowed to be whole, they don't lose themselves in the in-between. They discover that the in-between is exactly where they're strong. Understanding before teaching. The moment everything shifted wasn't dramatic. No tears. No long speech. Just a pause, long enough for me to realize I had been trying to teach values to a nervous system that didn't feel safe yet. In the U.S., parenting advice often focuses on what to teach: confidence, independence, resilience. What rarely gets equal attention is when to teach. And timing, it turns out, is everything. For years, I believed my job was to correct, explain, and guide. When my child behaved in ways that felt too American, I moved quickly into teaching mode. Correct the tone. Clarify the rule. Reinforce the value. What I didn't see was how my speed itself was the problem. Neuroscience is blunt about this. The brain cannot learn when it's dysregulated. Understanding has to come before instruction, or instruction turns into noise. Children don't resist lessons because they're defiant. They resist because their nervous systems are overwhelmed. When stress hormones are high, the brain prioritizes protection over absorption. I watched my child shut down during conversations that were meant to help. Short answers. Avoidant eyes. A body signaling, "This is too much." I mistook that for disinterest. It was overload. American culture often celebrates directness. Say it clearly. Address issues early. In many other cultures, meaning is layered. Timing is respected. Emotion is read before words are exchanged. Parenting between these styles requires more than compromise, it requires attunement. Attunement means noticing what the body is saying before the mouth responds. The shift began when I started asking a different internal question. Not what lesson should I teach here, but what does my child need to feel understood right now? That question slowed me down. Instead of correcting immediately, I mirrored. It sounds like you felt embarrassed. It looks like you were frustrated. According to developmental psychology, emotional mirroring activates a child's parasympathetic nervous system. Safety increases. Learning becomes possible. At first, this felt counterintuitive. Understanding felt passive. Teaching felt active. But the science says otherwise. Understanding is an intervention. It reorganizes the brain's response to stress. Once my child felt seen, conversations changed texture. Resistance softened. Curiosity replaced defensiveness. Teaching stopped feeling like a battle and started feeling like a dialogue. I noticed something else too. When I prioritized understanding, my own emotions regulated faster. The pressure to perform as a good parent eased. That matters. Children co-regulate with adults. When the adult is calm, the child's brain follows. This isn't theory. It's biology. In the U.S., many parents worry that too much understanding leads to permissiveness. But understanding is not agreement. It's acknowledgement. You can validate a feeling without validating a behavior. I see why you're angry doesn't mean do whatever you want. It means you're not alone in this emotion. That distinction builds trust without eroding boundaries. There was a moment when this approach was tested. My child came home upset after a cultural misunderstanding at school. My instinct was to explain context, to defend values, to fix. Instead, I listened. Long enough that the story unfolded fully. Only then did I share perspective. The result surprised me. My child asked more questions. Not defensive ones, curious ones. Understanding had opened the door teaching kept closed. Cognitive science explains this well. The brain learns best in states of moderate arousal, not too calm, not too stressed. Understanding brings arousal down to a workable level. It's like tuning an instrument before playing it. Without tuning, even the right notes sound wrong. This approach also reshaped how I viewed values. Values aren't absorbed through repetition. They're absorbed through experience. When a child experiences empathy, they internalize empathy. When they experience respect, they learn respect. Teaching values without modeling understanding is like describing music to someone who's never heard sound. I stopped treating cultural differences as problems to correct and started treating them as data to explore. What does this mean to you? Became a powerful question. It signaled respect. It invited reflection. According to self-determination theory, autonomy and relatedness are core psychological needs. Understanding satisfies both. It allows a child to think independently while staying connected. If you're raising kids between cultures in the U.S. and feeling exhausted by constant explaining, consider this: you may be teaching too soon. Pause. Regulate. Understand first. Teaching will land deeper when the emotional ground is stable. The irony is that once I led with understanding, I had to teach less. Values showed up naturally, in choices, in empathy, in how my child treated others. The lessons I worried about losing became visible without force. Understanding heals because it restores agency. It tells a child, your inner world matters. From that place, growth becomes voluntary. Sustainable. Real. Looking back, I wish I had learned this earlier. Teaching is important. Guidance matters. But without understanding, it becomes noise in a crowded mind. With understanding, it becomes a bridge. And that bridge, built patiently, moment by moment, is what allows children raised between two cultures to walk forward without feeling torn behind them. Science of emotional healing. Healing sounds like a soft word. Vague. Optional. In the U.S., it's often treated as a personal project, something you do after work, maybe with a podcast and a cup of tea. What I didn't understand for a long time is that healing isn't a mood. It's a biological process. And when you're raising kids between cultures, biology is quietly involved in every reaction you and your child have. Emotional healing begins in the nervous system, not in positive thinking. When families move, adapt, translate values, and negotiate identities daily, their nervous systems spend a lot of time on high alert. The brain reads novelty as potential threat. New rules. New accents. New expectations. Over time, the body learns to stay ready. Shoulders tense. Breathing shortens. Patience thins. You can't lecture a nervous system into calm. You have to show it safety. Neuroscience explains why understanding feels so powerful. When a child feels understood, the brain releases oxytocin, a hormone linked to trust and bonding. Oxytocin lowers cortisol, the stress hormone that blocks learning and empathy. This isn't poetic. It's chemical. Understanding literally changes the internal environment in which growth happens. I used to think healing meant fixing something broken. But nothing was broken. Our systems were overloaded. According to polyvagal theory, the nervous system constantly scans for cues of safety or danger. Tone of voice. Facial expression. Pace. When I corrected my child quickly, even gently, their body often heard urgency, not care. Their system shifted into defense. Teaching failed because biology vetoed it. Once I learned to slow down, to soften my voice, to name feelings before naming rules, something measurable changed. Bedtimes improved. Arguments shortened. Recovery after conflict sped up. These aren't coincidences. They're signs of regulation. When the nervous system feels safe, it rebounds faster. Science also explains why healing isn't linear. Some days felt calm. Others felt like setbacks. Stress accumulates. Weather, school pressure, social tension, political noise, all of it layers onto a child's nervous system. Add cultural translation on top, and it's a lot to carry. Healing doesn't erase stress. It increases capacity. Like strengthening a muscle, not removing gravity. One concept that reshaped my parenting was co-regulation. Children don't self-regulate first. They borrow regulation from adults. Your calm becomes their calm. Your panic becomes their panic. This is why telling a child to calm down rarely works. Their brain needs a regulated brain nearby to sync with. When I learned to regulate myself, breathing slower, pausing before responding, I wasn't just modeling behavior. I was lending my nervous system to my child. American culture emphasizes independence early. Self-soothing. Self-expression. Self-management. Those skills matter. But neuroscience is clear. Independence grows out of connection, not instead of it. Emotional healing accelerates when children feel supported, not pushed. There's also a misconception that healing makes kids fragile. The opposite is true. Studies show that children who experience emotional attunement develop stronger stress resilience. Their brains learn that discomfort is survivable. That emotions move. that repair is possible. Avoidance creates fragility. Understanding builds durability. I saw this when my child faced discrimination at school. The old me would have rushed to solutions. Advice. Armor. Instead, I listened. I named the hurt. I sat in silence longer than was comfortable. That silence wasn't empty. It was regulating. Only after the body settled did we talk about action. My child didn't just feel better. They felt capable. Healing also requires consistency. Not perfection. Consistency. Predictable responses. Apologies when you miss. Repairs when you snap. Research shows that repair matters more than harmony. Families don't need to avoid conflict. They need to recover from it reliably. Recovery teaches the nervous system that rupture isn't abandonment. This changed how I viewed mistakes. Yelling once wasn't the end. Ignoring it was. When I apologized sincerely, without excuses, my child relaxed. Apologies signal safety. They tell the brain that power doesn't mean unpredictability. That authority can be accountable. There's a quiet grief that surfaces during healing too. Grief for what you didn't receive. For parenting models you're outgrowing. For versions of yourself that coped by staying silent. That grief is part of the process. Trauma research shows that naming grief prevents it from turning into rigidity. When adults process their own pain, children don't have to inherit it. If you're raising kids between cultures in the U.S. and wondering whether understanding is enough, trust the science. Understanding regulates. Regulation enables learning. Learning shapes values. Values guide behavior. The order matters. Healing isn't about being calm all the time. It's about returning to calm more easily. It's about shortening the distance between rupture and repair. It's about teaching the nervous system, yours and your child's, that safety is available, even when things are hard. Over time, I noticed a shift in myself too. Less reactivity. More curiosity. The urge to control softened into a willingness to connect. That's not personality change. That's nervous system recovery. Emotional healing doesn't announce itself. It shows up in ordinary moments. A softer response. A quicker apology. A child who comes to you instead of away from you. Science explains the mechanism. Understanding provides the access. And once healing takes root, values don't have to be enforced. They emerge naturally, quietly, and with strength. Small values, big impact. Big values sound impressive. Integrity. Freedom. Success. Respect. They look good on walls, school mottos, and social media captions. But in real family life, especially in the United States, where cultures collide daily, big values rarely take root through big speeches. They grow through small, repeated behaviors that quietly teach a child how to live when nobody is watching. I used to believe values were something you installed early, like software. Teach them once. Reinforce them often. Protect them fiercely. The more I tried, the more resistance I met. That's because values aren't learned through instruction alone. Behavioral psychology shows that values are encoded through patterns, not principles. Children don't remember what you say in serious moments. They remember what you do in ordinary ones. Living in the U.S. amplifies this truth. Children are exposed to powerful narratives about success, independence, and self-expression. If family values remain abstract, they get drowned out. But when values show up in daily micro-decisions, they become embodied. Real. Transferable. I started paying attention to the smallest moments. How we talk to service workers. How we respond to mistakes. How we handle waiting. These moments are cultural translators. They tell children what matters without announcing it. Social learning theory confirms this. Behavior observed repeatedly becomes internalized faster than behavior explained repeatedly. One value I cared deeply about was respect. In my upbringing, respect looked like obedience and restraint. In American culture, respect often looks like direct communication and self-advocacy. Instead of arguing definitions, I focused on behavior. Listening fully before responding. Acknowledging effort even when disagreeing. Saying thank you with eye contact. Respect became visible, not theoretical. Another value was responsibility. Not the heavy kind that turns children into caretakers, but the grounded kind that builds agency. In the U.S., independence is encouraged early. I used that as an ally, not a threat. Small responsibilities, packing a bag, managing time, fixing small mistakes, became lessons in competence. Neuroscience shows that mastery experiences increase dopamine, reinforcing motivation. Responsibility felt good, not burdensome. Kindness was trickier. Kindness is praised everywhere, but rarely defined. I learned that kindness without boundaries turns into self-erasure. So I modeled both. Saying no politely. Resting without apology. Standing up without aggression. These are nuanced skills, especially across cultures. But children learn nuance through observation, not slogans. One of the most powerful values I passed on wasn't intentional at first. Repair. When I made a mistake, I named it. When I snapped, I apologized. Repair teaches accountability without shame. Research on moral development shows that children who witness adults taking responsibility develop stronger ethical reasoning. They learn that being wrong isn't dangerous, it's human. American culture moves fast. Productivity is rewarded. Slowness feels inefficient. I pushed back gently by modeling presence. Sitting down during conversations. Pausing before answering. This wasn't about rejecting American values. It was about integrating them with depth. Speed plus presence is sustainable. Speed without presence is exhausting. I also paid attention to how I talked about others. Political differences. Cultural misunderstandings. Parenting choices. Children absorb how we frame disagreement. If disagreement is treated as moral failure, children learn rigidity. If it's treated as difference, children learn discernment. Discernment is a value that travels well across cultures. Science supports this focus on the small. The brain forms habits through repetition and emotional salience. 1,000 small moments shape neural pathways more reliably than one big conversation. This is why consistency matters more than intensity. Over time, the impact became visible. My child began correcting themselves gently instead of harshly. Helping without being asked. Expressing disagreement without fear. These weren't achievements to celebrate loudly. They were signs of internalization. If you're raising kids between cultures in the U.S. and worried about losing your values, look closer at your daily rhythms. Values aren't stored in tradition alone. They live in tone, pace, attention. Children don't need you to defend values. They need you to demonstrate them in ways that fit their world. This approach also reduced conflict. When values are lived instead of enforced, children don't feel controlled. They feel guided. Autonomy increases. Trust deepens. According to self-determination theory, autonomy-supportive environments lead to more ethical behavior, not less. Small value scale. A child who learns to listen learns to empathize. A child who learns to repair learns accountability. A child who learns to rest learns self-respect. These skills don't expire. They adapt. They travel into friendships, workplaces, and families of their own. Looking back, I didn't pass on values by holding them tightly. I passed them on by letting them show up naturally in daily life. Big impact doesn't require big gestures. It requires alignment. And that's the quiet power of small values. They don't ask for attention. They ask for consistency. And when children grow up inside that consistency, they carry those values forward, not because they were told to, but because they know how to live them. A family rebuilt slowly. Rebuilding a family doesn't look like starting over. There's no clean reset button, no dramatic apology that fixes everything at once. It looks slower. Messier. Almost boring from the outside. And that's exactly why it works. In the U.S., where transformation stories are often loud and fast, I had to learn that real healing inside a family happens quietly. Through repetition rather than revelation. After understanding came science, and after science came practice. Day after day. Conversation after conversation. Not to fix the past, but to build something new on top of it. A different emotional rhythm. A family culture that could actually hold all of us without asking anyone to shrink. At first, progress was subtle. Fewer explosions. Slightly shorter silences after conflict. My child began coming to me sooner instead of holding things in. My partner and I disagreed without escalating as quickly. These weren't miracles. They were signs of a nervous system learning a new pattern. Neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to rewire, doesn't require dramatic change. It requires consistent input. One of the biggest shifts was how we handled conflict. We stopped treating it like a failure and started treating it like information. What went wrong? Where did stress enter the system? What need went unmet? Family therapy research shows that families who normalize conflict recover faster and trust deeper. Avoidance creates fragility. Repair creates strength. We also slowed the pace of expectations. American life moves fast, and it's easy to let that speed dictate family dynamics. More activities. More goals. More pressure. We chose less. Fewer commitments. More margin. More unscheduled time. Not as a rejection of ambition, but as an investment in regulation. The brain heals best when it has space. In that space, conversations changed. They became less reactive and more reflective. My child started naming feelings instead of acting them out. That's not maturity beyond their age. That's skill development. Emotional literacy grows in environments where feelings are welcomed, not managed away. I also noticed how rebuilding required patience with myself. There were days I slipped back into old patterns. Raised my voice. Withdrew emotionally. The difference now was repair. I didn't justify it. I acknowledged it. I reacted from stress, not from care. That sentence mattered. It told my child that growth isn't linear and accountability doesn't threaten connection. Culturally, this was new for me. In my upbringing, authority rarely apologized. In the U.S., apology is often framed as weakness. In reality, apology is structure. It reassures the nervous system that power won't become unpredictable. Research confirms this. Children who receive sincere apologies from caregivers show higher trust and emotional security. Rebuilding also meant redefining success. Not academic achievements. Not social status. Emotional health. Curiosity. The ability to come back together after disagreement. These metrics don't show up on report cards, but they shape a life more deeply than grades ever will. There was a moment that made the progress visible. My child made a mistake at school and came home anxious. Instead of hiding it, they told me immediately. No rehearsed defense. No fear. Just honesty. That moment was the result of hundreds of small repairs before it. Trust is cumulative. Family systems theory explains this well. Families operate like ecosystems. Change one pattern consistently, and the whole system adapts. You don't need everyone to change at once. You need enough safety for change to spread. That's what happened. Slowly, the atmosphere shifted. My partner and I also learned to support each other differently. Less blame. More curiosity. What made today hard? Replaced why did you react that way? Language matters. It shapes perception. Perception shapes behavior. This is cognitive psychology in action. Rebuilding didn't erase cultural differences. It integrated them. We kept traditions that felt grounding. We let go of ones that felt performative. We allowed American values to influence us without letting them dominate. The family became a third space, not one culture or the other, but something uniquely ours. If you're in the middle of rebuilding, here's a stabilizing truth. Slow progress is not a sign of failure. It's a sign of depth. Fast change often bypasses the nervous system. Slow change rewires it. Healing that lasts doesn't rush. There were still hard days. Still misunderstandings. Still moments of fatigue. But they no longer defined us. Recovery time shortened. Laughter returned faster. The baseline emotional temperature of the home rose from tense to warm. Looking back, rebuilding wasn't about becoming a perfect family. It was about becoming a responsive one. A family that could bend without breaking. A family where understanding wasn't a phase, but a habit. And that's the quiet win. Not a dramatic ending, but a sustainable middle. A family rebuilt slowly learns something essential. Love doesn't need to be intense to be strong. It needs to be steady. The values we chose to carry forward. Some endings don't feel like endings at all. They feel like a quiet decision you keep making every day. Section 12 is not about wrapping life in a neat bow. It's about standing still for a moment and asking a different kind of question, after everything you've lived through. What values are you actually passing on? In America, values are everywhere. They're in school slogans, parenting books, political debates, social media bios. Everyone seems to be selling a version of the right way to raise kids. Independence. Confidence. Achievement. happiness. All good things. But when you live between cultures, you start noticing something uncomfortable. Values sound clean in theory, but they get messy in real life. I used to think values were things you taught directly. You explain them. You correct behavior. You reward the right choices. What I didn't understand is that children don't learn values from what you say when life is calm. They learn from who you are when life is hard. Stress is the curriculum. There was a moment that clarified this for me. We were driving home after a long day. Everyone was tired. My child asked a simple question that landed badly. I snapped. Not loudly, not dramatically, but enough. Silence filled the car. Old version of me would have justified it internally and moved on. New version felt the weight of that silence as information. What value was I teaching right then? Not patience. Not emotional regulation. Not respect. Just efficiency over connection. And that was the moment I realized something crucial. Values are transmitted through regulation, not instruction. Neuroscience backs this up. Mirror neurons in the brain cause children to absorb emotional states more than verbal lessons. Your calm teaches calm. Your repair teaches accountability. Your curiosity teaches openness. Your rigidity teaches fear. You are the lesson plan. So we made intentional choices. Not grand ones. Practical ones. We chose emotional honesty over emotional performance. It was okay to say, I don't know. It was okay to say, I was wrong. Those phrases became normal, not dramatic. We chose understanding over control. That didn't mean permissiveness. It meant asking better questions before setting boundaries. What's driving this behavior, instead of how do I stop it? Psychology shows that behavior is communication. When you respond to the message instead of the noise, behavior changes naturally. We chose connection over comparison. In a culture obsessed with benchmarks, this was radical. Grades mattered, but nervous system health mattered more. Social success mattered, but self-trust mattered more. This wasn't lowering standards. It was redefining them. We also chose cultural integration instead of cultural competition. No, this way is better. No silent ranking of values between countries. We talked openly about differences. Climate. Politics. Social norms. We let contradictions exist without forcing resolution. That flexibility became a value in itself. There's research showing that children raised with bicultural competence, the ability to navigate multiple cultural frameworks, develop stronger cognitive flexibility and empathy. They learn that identity isn't fragile. It can expand without breaking. That's a gift. One of the most powerful values we chose was repair over perfection. Conflict wasn't the enemy. Unrepaired conflict was. Every rupture became an opportunity to model how adults come back together. This teaches something deeper than harmony, resilience. Over time, I saw the results. My child didn't become flawless. They became expressive. They didn't become fearless. They became brave enough to speak. They didn't avoid mistakes. They learned how to recover from them. That's not accidental. That's culture, practiced daily. Living in the U.S. adds another layer. Individualism is strong here. So we intentionally taught interdependence. Not dependence. Interdependence. The idea that needing others doesn't weaken you. It humanizes you. Studies in developmental psychology show that children who feel securely connected take healthier risks later in life. And then there's love. Not the dramatic kind. The consistent kind. Love is presence. Love is predictability. Love is showing up emotionally even when you're tired. That kind of love doesn't go viral. But it builds adults who don't confuse chaos with passion. If you're raising kids between cultures, here's a grounding truth: you don't have to choose one value system and defend it. You get to cure it. You get to keep what heals and discard what harms. That's not confusion. That's wisdom. The real question isn't what values should I pass on? It's what values am I already living under pressure? Because that's what your children are absorbing. Understanding heals. Not because it explains everything, but because it softens the nervous system enough for change to happen. When children feel understood, they don't need to rebel to be seen. When adults feel understood, they don't need to control to feel safe. This story doesn't end with certainty. It ends with intention. With a family that keeps choosing awareness over autopilot. Curiosity over judgment. Repair over avoidance. And maybe that's the most honest ending of all. Not a perfect family. A conscious one. If you're still here, it means this story touched something real inside you. Maybe it reminded you of your own childhood. Maybe it reflected the quiet fears you carry while raising your kids between two cultures. Or maybe it simply whispered a truth you've felt but never had words for. Understanding heals more than control ever could. Raising children in the United States, while carrying another culture, another climate, another way of loving, is not about choosing sides. It's about choosing awareness. It's about realizing that every small moment, every repair after conflict, every calm response under pressure becomes a value your children will carry long after you stop explaining it. This journey doesn't end here. In fact, this is where it really begins. In the next videos, we'll go deeper into healing through real-life stories, emotional resilience in multicultural families, and how to grow as a parent and partner without losing yourself in America's fast-paced life. Stories you won't find in textbooks. Lessons you only learn by living them. So if you're navigating love, marriage, parenting, or self-growth between cultures, if you believe personal development starts with emotional understanding, if you want content that heals, not preaches, subscribe to the channel now. Like this video if it resonated with you. Share it with someone who's raising kids between two worlds. Because the values we pass on don't come from perfection. They come from awareness. And awareness begins with one honest story at a time.